Podcast migration is a pretty simple and straightforward process, but there is more to it than meets the eye. If you don't do it the right way, you could end up struggling with lost data, dead episodes, and lost listeners, like it happened to me. So in this episode, we look at the entire podcast migration process and things that you need to keep in mind if you are migrating your podcast. Hello and welcome to TPU TV. My name is Dilip. I am a blogger, affiliate marketer, and a podcaster, and I host the show, The Podcasting University, which is about podcasts and podcasting tips. So if you haven't subscribed to the show, and if you're not a listener of the show, then go ahead and subscribe to the show. You'll be able to find the links to the show in the description box below this video. Go ahead and subscribe to the show so that you can listen to the latest episodes that I release on the podcast. Now, if you're new here, on this channel, I release videos about practical and implementable podcasting tips, something that I do not usually share on my podcast, but there are some episodes that are an overlap on the podcast and on this video. So if you're new here, then go ahead and subscribe to this channel. You'll be able to find a button somewhere here. Click on that button, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to press the bell notification in order to stay updated with the latest videos that I release. And if you like what I'm sharing here, then don't forget to press the thumbs up icon. On to today's video. This week, we're going to talk about podcast migration. What is podcast migration? Why do you need to do it? What are the steps involved? And how to ensure that your podcast migration is seamless. So let's get started. Podcast migration isn't unusual. And in 99% of the cases, it is because of the hosting company. You are either dissatisfied with their customer support or their service, or you don't find value for the money that you're spending with your podcast hosting company. And that isn't uncommon either. Companies are known to be bad to their customers, and it isn't uncommon in the podcasting industry either. So why stay with somebody that you're not satisfied with and from where you're not getting value for the money that you're spending? Another reason why you would want to migrate your show is if you're tied up with a podcast provider for a show that you're creating along with them, and you're in a contract with them for a specific amount of period, and then you want to get out of the contract. Once the contract ends, you want to move your host, you want to move to a different hosting provider. That could be another reason why you would want to migrate your show. A lot of these podcast hosting companies often come out with originals, like for example, the Spotify original. But when you do that along with these podcast providers, they ask you to get into a contract with them, a contract for a specific number of months or maybe an year. So during that period, you cannot switch over to a different host and you have to host with them. But once that contract period is over, you might want to switch over to a new podcast host, which is when you might want to go through the entire podcast migration process. In both of these, the steps that are going to be involved is pretty much the same. But if you are tied up with a podcast provider who doesn't offer migration easily, or where the process isn't as simple as it is, then you might have to reach out to their customer support team and request their help in order to migrate your podcast. I'm assuming that you are with a podcast provider who is offering you a simple way of transitioning your episodes, and that is why I'm going to show you the steps that are involved, which is the usual process that is involved in podcast migration if you are planning to migrate your podcast. Podcast migration is a pretty simple process, and thanks to the way podcasts are handled, it is a matter of about 5 minutes to migrate your show from one podcast host to the other, unlike the process involved in migrating a blog, which is transferring all of the files physically and manually to another host. In podcasting, there is nothing like that. It is a very simple and straightforward process. So first, let us look at the entire process, and then we will talk about what are some of the things that you might want to keep in mind and where it could go wrong. So the podcast migration process involves 8 straightforward steps. We'll look at these 8 steps, which are pretty simple. So step 1 is to find a new host and sign up with them. And I'm assuming that you've already done that process. So here are 2 hosts that I have. The first one is Anchor and the second one is Bcast. So I'll show you how this works with both of these hosts. Now, it is pretty much the same with any host, so the process is going to be the same. Now you can see here when I open anchor.fm, on the top itself, I get an option that says switch to Anchor. And similarly with Bcast also, you will see there is an option that says switch to Bcast. So if I click this switch to Anchor button, it takes me to a page where it says switch in less than 5 minutes. So I just click on switch in less than 5 minutes. It takes me to a section where I need to enter the podcast name or the RSS feed. Now here, all I need to do is I can just enter the name of the podcast, or if I already have the RSS feed, I can enter that. So step 3 is to enter the name of your podcast here. I will enter the Podcasting University, and here is the podcast. All I need to now do is just select this podcast, and it says switch your podcast. So when I click on switch your podcast, it will take me to a page where it will ask me to create an account, since I don't have an account with Anchor. But if you have already signed up with Anchor, then I don't need to sign up again. All I need to do is just log into the account, and the option to migrate my podcast will be there. So let me quickly sign into my account. Now I've signed into my account, and I see that I'm getting these two options. One is there an agreement that says that I understand that importing will override any existing settings. And the second one says that I own and have licensed or all the rights necessary to import the podcast. So once I check both of these, I'm ready to hit the import podcast, and the podcast should be imported into my Anchor account. It is pretty much the same with Bcast as well. So when you click on switch to Bcast, it will take you to a page where it says search Apple Podcast. Now this is another option that some of the podcast hosting providers give you. So all I need to do is just enter the name of the podcast here, and the podcast appears. I just need to select that. And here, all I need to do is just enter my name, email address, and click on create account, after which I'll be able to create an account. Or if I already have an account, all I need to do is just sign in to bcast.fm, and then there will be an option of migrating. Now I've signed into my account. You can see here, this is my account where I've signed in. So if I go to podcasts, here it says import a podcast. So if I click on import a podcast, it takes me to a page where I can search for the podcast. Here it is, and I can click import the podcast, and the podcast is imported. Now it doesn't end here. It is here that the most critical steps actually start. Now once the podcast is imported, once you've hit the import podcast button, now you need to go back to your old host and submit your new RSS feed URL with your new host. Let me quickly show you how I have done that in my podcast DK Speaks, which is something that I've hosted with Anchor here. You can see here, this podcast is something that is hosted with Anchor. Now this podcast was hosted with Bcast, and I imported that to Anchor. And when I imported that to Anchor, what I did is I entered the new feed URL at Bcast in order to enable the redirect. So let me quickly show you my Bcast dashboard where I've entered that URL. So I go to podcast settings here, and I go to the advanced settings. And when I scroll to the bottom of the page, you can see here there is a section that says moving your podcast from Bcast. So if you're moving, what you have to do is you have to enter the new RSS feed, the new URL here, and click on save podcast. Once I do that, my podcast migration is complete. That is the simple process of podcast migration. Like what I said, there are a few things that you might want to keep in mind which could end up as a disaster if you don't take care of it. So let's look at what those things. Number one, don't upload any more episodes on your old podcast. Now, a lot of time we migrate in the middle of our publishing schedule, and we have new episodes that we either go and publish with the old host or which is scheduled with your old host. If you've done anything like that, then you might want to remove the scheduling that you've done. You would want to cancel that, and don't publish any episodes with your old podcast host, because if you do, those episodes will never show up on your podcast. And once the entire migration is complete and you terminate your account with your old podcast host, those episodes would simply disappear. So don't upload any new episodes with your old podcast host once you've initiated the migration process. Number two, ensure your ads are switched off. Now, this is a very important aspect in migration which a lot of people don't talk about. And this is something that I'm recommending out of my personal experience. Ensure that you switch off all programmatic ads if at all they are running with your old podcast host. Now, in my case, when I switched over my podcast from Spreaker to Acast, I was running programmatic ads at Spreaker, but I didn't switch off the programmatic ads at Spreaker and I migrated my podcast to Acast. What basically happened is the migration migrated all of the ads along with the episodes. And when it came into Acast, these ads were plugged into the episodes and they were playing and I had no option to switch them off. So I had to go back and re-upload all of those episodes again on Acast. Now, since I had only about 50 to 55 odd episodes, I could do that in a span of about 15 to 20 days. But if you have a lot of episodes, you will struggle doing this entire process. So before you initiate the transition, ensure that you're switching off any programmatic ads that you're running with your old podcast host. And only then initiate the migration process with your new podcast host. Number 3, take screenshots of your stats. Now, something that you might want to keep in mind is that when you migrate your podcast from one host to the other, most of your data is lost, which means that you won't have any statistics. You won't be able to find any statistics. All of that statistics that you have with your old podcast host is lost. When we switched over our podcast, The Tastes of India, to a new podcast host, basically from Audioboom to Bcast, we had close to about 5 lakh listens on Audioboom, which is something that we totally lost. So when we started off with Bcast, we had to start off afresh. Our data or our statistics started from zero. So if you are migrating your podcast host and you have a lot of listens on your old host, then I would recommend that you take a few screenshots of these statistics so that you can use them in the future if at all you want to. But keep in mind that your statistics are not going to be migrated if you migrate your podcast host. Number 4, inform your audience. Now, your audience wouldn't usually know about the migration. For them, everything works the way it was and they continue to listen to all of the episodes. Nothing changes. But if you are migrating your podcast, then I would recommend that you inform your subscribers or your listeners at least 2 weeks in advance. And what you should ideally be doing is you should be requesting them for their help in case they come across a dead episode so that they can reach out to you and let you know of these dead episodes and you can go ahead and rectify the problem. Also, once you've initiated the migration, I would recommend that you not release episodes for at least 14 days, at least 2 weeks, so that the entire migration process is complete. And when you're doing that, you might want to keep your listeners and subscribers informed. So just inform them that you will not be publishing episodes for the next 2 weeks because you're migrating your podcast to a new host. That will ensure that they are updated. They won't feel lost because they are not able to find new episodes for your podcast. So ensure that you're keeping your listeners informed. Now, another question that a lot of people have is, do you lose your subscribers if you're migrating your podcast host? We need to understand how the entire subscription process works. Now, the subscription process works with most of the podcast directories. Like, for example, if you have some subscribers on Spotify, they are subscribers on the Spotify platform. They are not subscribers on maybe Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts. So when you switch over your podcast to a new podcast host, none of these things changes at the podcast directory's end, which means Spotify will continue to serve your episodes the way they were doing, just that they will be fetching the data from a different URL. So nothing else changes with them, and which means that the podcast subscribers, the subscribers to your show, stay the way they are. They don't change. They will all continue to stay with that particular podcast directory and they will be there. They'll be able to listen to your podcast the way they've been doing that. So you don't need to worry about losing subscribers. The 5th and the final one, check if all of your episodes are playing. Now, this is a very critical and very important step. Now, when I migrated my podcast from Spreaker to Acast, while Google was fetching the data from the new feed, it was unable to play some of my old episodes. So when I went back and I verified all of these episodes at these different podcast directories after the migration was complete, I found that these episodes were not playing. I was able to reach out to the Google Podcast support and get it rectified. So once the migration process is complete, I would recommend that you go to these prominent directories and check if everything is working fine. If your podcast is playing well, and if there is any issues, if you're able to find any dead episodes, reach out to their customer support team and ensure that it is rectified. That is why this is a very critical process. And when you're enabling podcast migration, just ensure that you are not terminating your account with your old podcast host for at least 14 days. Wait for about 14 days for the entire migration process to be complete. Only after 14 days, go ahead and terminate your account with the old podcast host. So if you're planning to migrate your podcast, then this is a timeline that you need to keep in mind so that you are able to ensure that the migration is seamless. So that's all about podcast migration. Now, if you have any specific questions about podcast migration, then drop them in the comments below and I will respond to it. And if there is a need to create a specific video for that, I'll obviously go and create a video for you. I'm hoping that you enjoyed the information that I shared in this episode. If you did, then do give a thumbs up to this video and ensure that you're subscribing to this channel. Hit the subscribe button and the bell notification so that you stay updated with the latest episodes that I release. That is all that I have for this week. I'll be back again the next week with another important and interesting podcasting related information. Until then, keep watching TPU TV. This is goodbye from Dilip, and don't forget to subscribe to the Podcasting University podcast. You'll be able to find the link in the description box below, and you'll also be able to find a link to some of the recommended resources in podcasting in the description box below. And I need to mention that some of these links are affiliate links. So if you click on them and make a purchase, then I will earn a small commission without any additional cost to you. So I'm hoping that you enjoyed this episode. I'll be back again the next week. Keep watching TPU TV until then.